Hi guys, tonight the pagan cradle of December feasts. The religious fervor that drove the early Christian church to adopt December 25th was matched only by the sheer momentum of popular custom it sought to co-opt. The winter festivals of the ancient world were not merely days off, they were deep, necessary cultural safety vows tied to the rhythms of the agricultural year and the primal fear of the void. The most famous and chaotic of these was the Roman Saturnalia. Held roughly from December 17th to the 23rd, this festival was dedicated to Saturn, the god of agriculture, wealth, and time, a deity whose golden age was mythically associated with a time of peace and equality. For a Roman citizen living under the strict hierarchy of the empire, Saturnalia offered a week-long blissful descent into sanctioned anarchy. During this period, all public business ceased. Law courts were closed and schools shut their doors. The fundamental division of Roman society, that between master and slave, was temporarily inverted. Slaves were permitted to wear their master's clothing, sit at the head of the banquet table, and demand to be served by those who usually commanded them. They received gifts, usually small tokens like wax candles, cerae, or clay figurines, sigillaria. This temporary suspension of rank served a crucial sociological function. By allowing the suppressed energies of the lower classes to vent in a controlled, ritualistic manner, the ruling class ensured the stability of the hierarchy for the rest of the year. The entire society participated in a communal, ecstatic sigh of relief. The streets echoed with the drunken cry, "Io, Saturnalia!" The custom of giving and receiving gifts, now central to the modern American Christmas, finds one of its clearest secular antecedents here. The sigillaria were not symbols of spiritual redemption, but of human connection and festive spirit. The widespread use of greenery, holly, ivy, and laurel to decorate homes, streets, and temples during this time served as a visual promise that life had not been extinguished by the cold. It was a tangible protest against the barren landscape outside the city walls. As Saturnalia faded, the focus shifted to the more solemn and powerful festival celebrated on December 25th, the birthday of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. This cult, which gained massive imperial support under Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century, recognized the sun as the ultimate source of all life and power, a cosmic emperor whose annual rebirth coincided precisely with the winter solstice, the moment when the days definitively began to lengthen. This focus on December 25th was not a coincidence. The date was astronomically significant, marking the true turning point of the year in the Julian calendar then in use. For early Christians trying to spread their message, the existence of such a powerful, life-affirming pagan holiday dedicated to a light of the world presented both an obstacle and an opportunity. How could the Son of God, the ultimate spiritual light, compete with the visible, life-giving power of the literal sun? The answer, codified by the Western Church around the middle of the 4th century, was brilliant in its simplicity: assimilation. Instead of fighting the popular impulse to celebrate the return of the light on December 25th, the Church simply declared that day to be the feast of the Nativity of Christ. This act was not an official theological confirmation of Christ's actual birth date, which is unknown, but a cultural and evangelistic masterstroke. By merging the birth of the Christian Savior with the ancient solar festival, the Church provided a deep and immediate spiritual meaning for already beloved traditions. The flickering lights of the cerae now symbolized the light of salvation. The everlasting green of the holly spoke of eternal life, and the joy of the feast became a joy in the incarnation. This historical layering, the Roman Saturnalia contributing the elements of gift-giving, feasting, and the breakdown of order, and Sol Invictus providing the key date and the theme of light and rebirth, meant that Christmas, from its very inception, was a hybrid holiday. It was destined to carry within itself a permanent tension between the sacred and the secular, between pious worship and boisterous revelry. It is this inherent tension that the later Puritan settlers in America, the Pilgrims, would vehemently reject. They understood instinctively that the popular English Christmas, with its drunken mobs, pagan-derived greenery, and excessive feasting, was merely Saturnalia in a Christian guise. Their eventual attempt to ban the holiday in the New World would be their final desperate stand against the very cultural compromises made by the Roman Church centuries earlier. But for now, the deep, dark soil of Europe had provided the pagan cradle from which the world's most enduring winter feast would spring. Establishing December 25th as Christ's birth. The raw, intoxicating energy of Saturnalia and the solemn cosmic power of Sol Invictus provided a vibrant cultural template, but it lacked the singular spiritual focus the nascent Christian faith demanded. The task before the early Christian fathers, particularly in the city of Rome in the 4th century, was to take these riotous threads of pagan custom and reweave them into a tapestry centered entirely on the Incarnation, the belief that God had become man. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, the birthday of Jesus Christ was not celebrated. Theologically, the Church prioritized the celebration of the resurrection, Easter, and the Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles, often celebrated on January 6th. Birthdays in the Roman world were often associated with pagan gods or worldly rulers, and the focus of early Christian devotion was on the culmination of Christ's life, not its beginning. Moreover, no one knew the actual date of the Nativity. Scholars debated dates across March, April, and even January. Yet, as the Church moved from a persecuted minority to an institution with growing imperial support following Emperor Constantine's conversion, the strategy of confrontation gave way to one of conversion through accommodation. The Church was now actively competing with a flourishing religious landscape, and the immense popularity of the winter festivals could no longer be ignored.
The decision to place Christ's birth on December 25th was not reached by finding a forgotten scroll or a new revelation. It was an act of deliberate spiritual substitution. By the mid-4th century, with the power of the Sol Invictus cult still strong, Pope Julius I, though the exact date is debated, the move occurred roughly in the mid-300s, formally declared December 25th as the date for the Feast of the Nativity. The theological reasoning behind this decree was ingenious and twofold. Firstly, it was a masterful stroke of spiritual counter-programming. By claiming the day of the unconquered Son for the Son of God, the Church asserted Christ's ultimate supremacy. The message to the masses was clear. The Romans may have celebrated the rebirth of the physical light on this day, but Christians celebrated the coming of the true light, who conquered not just the darkness of winter, but the darkness of sin itself. The Son was merely God's creation. Christ was God incarnate. Secondly, a separate but related tradition known as the calculus of the Incarnation provided a convenient spiritual justification. This theory held that Christ was conceived on the same day he died, the date of the crucifixion, traditionally March 25th. Counting forward 9 months from March 25th naturally placed the birth date on December 25th. This symmetrical logic provided the necessary religious gravitas to legitimize a date chosen largely for its cultural utility. The effect of the decree was revolutionary. The raucous public energy previously dedicated to Roman gods was now channeled into a Christian feast. The evergreen decorations, once symbols of pagan defiance against winter, were now interpreted as symbols of Christ's everlasting life. The feasting and gift-giving of Saturnalia, while often remaining secular and boisterous, began to take on a new Christian veneer of charity and generosity, recalling the gifts of the Magi. However, the blending of the sacred and the profane was far from seamless. The Church had succeeded in converting the calendar date, but it had a much harder time purging the riotous spirit of the old festivals. In parts of Europe, especially as the centuries moved into the medieval period, Christmas retained the anarchic, ritualistic reversal of roles inherited from Saturnalia. Groups of revelers, often masked, mummers, would roam the streets, demanding food and drink in exchange for impromptu performances, a precursor to modern caroling, but often involving coercion and public drunkenness. This failure to fully control the carnival spirit of the feast would eventually prove to be the holiday's undoing in the eyes of the most severe religious reformers.
The very compromises that allowed Christianity to successfully supplant paganism, the embrace of feasting, the blending of secular joy with sacred observance, would be the exact elements later cited by the Puritans as proof of the holiday's corruption. For the American colonists, whose ancestors would later try to un-establish the holiday, the 4th century Nativity decree was the original sin of Christmas. It marked the moment the Church traded pure scriptural faith for popular pagan compromise, setting the historical stage for a centuries-long tug-of-war over how or even if the day should be celebrated. The stage was set, and the tension between the pious mass and the rowdy revelry would define the holiday for the next 1,200 years. A history of the American Christmas. The solemn decree of the 4th century may have successfully rebranded December 25th, but it failed utterly to tame the deep-seated impulse for riotous winter feasting. As Christianity solidified its grip across Europe during the Middle Ages, the spirit of Saturnalia did not die. It merely donned a cloak of piety and emerged as the 12 Days of Christmas, a period which often devolved into a prolonged, authorized spree of public disorder. In the medieval village and manor, Christmas was not a single quiet day. It was an extensive communal festival stretching from Christmas Day through Epiphany on January 6th. This extended duration was crucial, as it provided the poor and the lower classes with a mandated rest period and a temporary share in the abundance of the wealthy. The lord of the manor was socially and religiously obligated to open his great hall, providing food, ale, and warmth to his tenants. This generosity was less about spontaneous goodwill and more about ensuring the loyalty and stability of the feudal system. The most vivid illustration of this cultural reversal was the tradition of the Lord of Misrule. A concept directly descended from the master-servant switch of Saturnalia, the Lord of Misrule was a commoner, often a servant or student, who was elected or appointed to govern the revels from Christmas Eve until the end of the 12 days. For this brief, giddy tenure, he commanded obedience, staged elaborate games and plays, and dictated the flow of ale. Under the Lord of Misrule's command, the formal strictures of society were gleefully dismantled. The Feast of Fools, particularly popular in France, but with similar expressions across Europe, saw the lower clergy mock their superiors, often conducting parody masses and electing a bishop of fools. The Church itself struggled perpetually to suppress these excesses, viewing the mockery and drunkenness as dangerous sacrilege. Yet the custom endured, proving that the popular demand for ritualistic anarchy was a powerful, nearly unstoppable force. The streets were dominated by the mummers' plays and troops of masked carolers. Mumming involved costumed performers acting out traditional folk stories, often featuring death and resurrection themes, like the slaying of St. George by the Turkish knight. These performances were boisterous, often aggressive, and inherently tied to the custom of wassailing.
Wassailing, derived from the Old English greeting wassail, be well, was a crucial Christmas practice that embodied the holiday's transactional nature. Groups, often young men or the destitute, would roam from door to door, singing or performing. The goal was not purely artistic expression. It was a demand for alms, food, and most importantly, the strongest ale or cider. If a wealthy household failed to offer generous hospitality, the revelers might respond with boisterous noise, petty vandalism, or insults. In essence, the medieval Christmas was a social contract enforced by temporary authorized threat. The lower classes were granted the right to demand sustenance from the rich, ensuring they survived the harsh winter. It was a chaotic redistribution of wealth, masked by ritual and justified by Christian charity. The atmosphere was thick with noise, smoke, and excess. Fires blazed, immense Yule logs were dragged into homes, and tables groaned under the weight of roast boar, goose, and mountains of bread. It was a festival of the senses, the clanging of bells, the loud communal singing, the heavy aroma of spices and roasting meat, and the ubiquitous presence of alcohol. For the religious reformers of the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly the English Puritans, these traditions were an abomination. They saw not Christian charity, but pagan debauchery. They viewed the Lord of Misrule as a king of vice, the mumming as a disorderly begging, and the feasting as a gluttonous offense to the true spiritual meaning of the Nativity. They abhorred the use of holly, ivy, and mistletoe, dismissing them as relics of pagan tree worship. For the Puritans, who insisted on grounding all worship solely in Scripture, the entire Christmas structure, from the arbitrarily chosen date to the ritualistic excess, was proof that the Church of England was still half Catholic, half pagan, and desperately in need of cleansing. It was this medieval legacy of unruly Christmas that the future American pilgrims were not just leaving behind, but actively fleeing, determined to establish a new world free from the intoxicating chaos of the European winter feast. Their rejection would be absolute, setting the stage for one of the great cultural conflicts in early colonial history. When Christmas was outlawed, continued. The ideological fervor that gripped the Puritan movement in 17th century England was a revolutionary force aimed at purifying both the church and the soul. They viewed the celebration of Christmas not merely as a quaint, misguided tradition, but as an act of calculated defiance against spiritual truth. Their objections were multifaceted and absolute, forming the theological backbone for the banishment of the holiday across 2 continents. Firstly, their adherence to sola scriptura, Scripture alone, was paramount. They argued that the Bible provided no instruction, command, or example for celebrating Christ's birth. Therefore, any such observance was a human invention, a superstitious addition that violated God's laws. If the Bible did not command it, the faithful should not observe it. By embracing December 25th, the Catholic Church, in their view, had merely sanctified a pagan holiday, prioritizing popular custom over divine text. Secondly, they despised the moral anarchy that the medieval Christmas brought. They saw the 12 days of Christmas as a breeding ground for sloth, gluttony, drunkenness, and sexual license. The spectacle of the Lord of Misrule, the aggressive mumming, and the transactional nature of wassailing were, to the Puritans, clear signs of the devil's influence. They believed that time was a sacred gift from God, and to waste 12 days in idleness and excess was an unforgivable affront. They sought to establish a rigorously ordered, morally disciplined society where piety and industry reigned supreme. This clash of worldviews reached its political peak in England. As the power of the Puritan-led Parliament grew, so did the assault on the holiday. In 1644, with the English Civil War underway, Parliament formally issued an ordinance abolishing Christmas. The official government decree mandated that December 25th was to be observed strictly as a day of fasting and repentance, urging citizens to remember the sins that had necessitated a civil war, rather than celebrating a frivolous feast. The government's enforcement was brutal and immediate. Shops were forced open by soldiers. Ministers who dared hold Christmas services were fined, and troops patrolled the streets to suppress any signs of revelry, seizing decorations like holly and ivy. This suppression led to serious civil unrest and riots in places like Canterbury, where citizens violently protested the loss of their traditional feast day. To the Puritans, the ensuing disorder simply validated their ban. Christmas was inherently riotous and must be quelled. The influence of this Puritan purge traveled directly across the Atlantic with the separatists who founded the Plymouth colony. These pilgrims, a particularly radical fringe of the Puritan movement, had already rejected the holiday while they were living in Leiden, Holland. Upon establishing their New World colony, their position was immediately enacted. In 2016, during that harrowing first winter, Governor William Bradford documented the colony's first encounter with the holiday in his journal of Plymouth Plantation. On Christmas morning, when the vast majority of the community was engaged in the arduous task of cutting wood and constructing the common house, their shared home, a group of the strangers, those non-separatist settlers, refused to work. They claimed it was against their conscience to labor on Christmas Day. Bradford, recognizing the direct challenge to the colony's discipline and the Puritan principle of industry, swiftly confronted them. He allowed the men to retire to their cabins, instructing them that if they intended to observe the day for religious devotion, they should do so privately. However, when he returned later that day, he found them in the street engaged in public sports, pitching the bar, and playing games.
Bradford's response was sharp and decisive, a foundational moment in the history of American work ethic. If they made the keeping of it a matter of devotion, let them keep their houses, but there should be no gaming or reveling in the streets. He then confiscated their equipment, effectively enforcing the ban. His point was clear. In Plymouth, Christmas was either a day of quiet private contemplation or it was a day of work, but it was absolutely not a day of public feasting or celebration. The outright prohibition continued in the later Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1659, the Massachusetts General Court passed a law imposing a 5-shilling fine on anyone found celebrating the day. This ban remained on the books for over 2 decades, cementing Boston and the New England colonies as the most hostile places in the Western world toward Christmas. The Protestant purge thus successfully eradicated the celebration of Christmas from vast swaths of early America. For a long, silent period, there was no sound of Christmas bells, no scent of pine or roast goose, and no public feasting in much of New England. This cultural vacuum, established by religious decree, would dramatically set the American holiday experience apart from that of Europe for the next 2 centuries. The survival of German and Catholic traditions. While the Puritan iron fist successfully crushed public Christmas celebrations in New England, American colonial life was a patchwork of diverse cultures and faiths. Outside the strict confines of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, the festive spirit, though often subdued and private, flickered stubbornly, sustained by Catholic and various Protestant minority groups, most notably the German immigrants. For these communities, Christmas was not a papish abomination, but a cherished tie to their homeland and a necessary source of joy in a harsh new world. The most profound resistance to the Puritan ban came from the colonies that prioritized religious tolerance, such as Pennsylvania and Maryland. Maryland, founded in the 1630s by the Catholic Lord Baltimore, was established explicitly as a haven for English Catholics who faced persecution at home. For the Catholic settlers here, the celebration of Christmas was not merely a cultural event, but a fundamental religious obligation. The Christmas Mass remained the absolute center of the day. Despite political turmoil and periods where the Protestant majority tried to suppress them, Catholic families in Maryland kept the flame alive in their homes. They observed the traditional Advent fasting period leading up to the 25th, culminating in a solemn midnight Mass. In their private homes, they might discreetly decorate with small sprigs of holly and bay leaves, symbols that carried deep spiritual significance in their faith, the holly representing the crown of thorns and its berries the drops of Christ's blood. Their Christmas was quiet, devotional, and entirely focused on the Nativity, serving as a powerful, enduring contrast to the Puritan workday. Meanwhile, the arrival of German immigrants into the mid-Atlantic colonies, particularly Pennsylvania, brought with it a different yet equally resilient set of traditions. Beginning in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, these groups, including Lutherans, Moravians, and other sects, were fiercely devoted to their ancestral customs. The German concept of Christmas was rich, warm, and domesticated, providing the colonies with some of the most enduring elements of the modern American holiday. The Moravians, in particular, created strong communal celebrations. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which they founded in 1741, Christmas was a major event marked by beautiful communal candlelight services. They introduced the tradition of the puts, an elaborate nativity scene or a miniature landscape representing the Christmas story. More significantly, German families in Pennsylvania were responsible for introducing the earliest versions of the Christmas tree to American soil. These weren't the grand, brightly lit trees of the later Victorian era. They were small, private evergreens decorated with fruits, paper ornaments, or perhaps small lighted candles, kept hidden within the home. The Weihnachtsbaum was a domestic symbol of life and hope. Since the practice was viewed suspiciously by non-Germans, it remained a clandestine, internal tradition for decades, a secret comfort against the puritanical austerity that dominated the broader colonial narrative. Furthermore, the German immigrants introduced the figure of Christkind, or Christ child, as the gift bringer, a tradition distinct from the Dutch Sinterklaas. This figure later evolved into the English term Kriskringel, eventually merging and blurring with the American Santa Claus figure. In these German and Catholic enclaves, Christmas was not a public riot, but a domestic act of resistance. It was celebrated behind closed doors, often with an acute awareness that the surrounding culture disapproved. The existence of these minority traditions, the quiet mass in Maryland, the secret Christmas tree in Pennsylvania, the communal candles of the Moravians, created isolated pockets where the festive spirit was never truly extinguished. The Puritan legacy was one of legislative prohibition. The German and Catholic legacy was one of cultural perseverance. When the American Revolution finally broke the Puritans' cultural dominance and the nation began searching for unifying secular traditions, it was these quietly nurtured customs that provided the seeds for the great holiday revival of the 19th century. The flickering candle, held against the colonial cold, was finally ready to light the nation. The day of labor, not leisure. For the passengers of the Mayflower, the arrival of December 25, 1621, was a moment charged with ideological tension. They had endured the horrors of the first winter, the great sickness that claimed half their number, and now were entering a new precarious season. The very notion of celebration was foreign to the separatist pilgrims, but for the non-separatist, strangers aboard, the day was expected, if meagerly observed, annual respite. The theological foundation of the separatist's life was the regulative principle of worship, a stringent doctrine asserting that only those acts explicitly commanded in the Bible were permissible in worship. Since the scriptures did not command the celebration of the Nativity, the day held no sacred significance for them. It was merely another day in the calendar. And in a desperate colony clinging to survival, every day was a day for work.
Governor William Bradford, the colony's central figure, recorded the events of that first official Christmas in his meticulous journal of Plymouth Plantation, a primary source that provides a chilling glimpse into the Puritan mind. The morning of December 25th began as any other, cold, arduous, and devoted to the collective effort of survival. Bradford and the majority of the community were outside, their hands frozen but busy, either cutting and splitting the thick oak logs necessary for building permanent homes or gathering thatch for roofs. They worked to fortify the settlement, driven by the knowledge that idleness was a sin and that the next ship's arrival with fresh supplies was entirely uncertain. However, a cohort of the strangers, those non-separatist members who had joined the voyage for economic reasons rather than religious zeal, refused to participate. They informed Bradford that their conscience would not allow them to work on Christmas Day. Bradford's immediate reaction was a masterpiece of Puritan logic and pragmatic leadership. He granted their request for the morning off, but framed it with characteristic sternness. He told them, according to his own account, that if they made it a matter of devotion, they should keep their houses, but there should be no gaming or reveling in the streets.
This was a brilliant strategic move. It respected the possibility of a religious observance, thus avoiding a direct challenge to their faith, but it simultaneously forbade the public frolic, the very rowdy pagan-tinged revelry they had fled in England. Later that day, however, Bradford discovered the strangers had misunderstood or perhaps deliberately ignored the subtle distinction. Returning from the fields, he found the group in the public square, engaged in vigorous pitching the bar, a form of weight tossing, and various stool ball games. They were celebrating Christmas in the traditional, secular, and disorderly fashion the Puritans so fiercely rejected. They had substituted the work of God for the play of man. Bradford's subsequent confrontation was swift and uncompromising. He sternly put an end to the sports, stating that it was against his conscience that some should labor for the common good while others took their ease and played games. His famous rebuke cut to the core of the Plymouth ethic. If they kept it a matter of devotion, they should mend their ways. If they kept it as a matter of custom, then they were violating the common good and wasting the strength of the colony. He confiscated their playthings and ordered them to retire to their dwellings for the remainder of the day. This incident, often overlooked in the grand narrative of American history, was hugely significant. It was the first legislative and moral declaration in the nascent American tradition that Christmas was not an intrinsic holiday, but a mere workday to be devoted to industry and survival. It cemented the Pilgrims' identity as a community defined by its rigid rejection of European customs and its uncompromising work ethic. The Puritan stance in Plymouth ensured that for the next century and a half, Christmas in New England would remain a non-holiday, a day for business as usual. This unique historical circumstance meant that when the American Christmas finally began to emerge in the 19th century, it had to be imported and reinvented from other sources: the Dutch, the Germans, and later the Victorians, because the earliest, most powerful colony had successfully purged the tradition from its cultural DNA. Dutch traditions in New York. 200 miles south of the somber, hard-working settlement of Plymouth, a completely different winter atmosphere enveloped the bustling port of New Amsterdam, the colonial heart of New Netherland, later to become New York. Here, the strictures of Puritan reform held little sway. Ruled by the Dutch West India Company and populated by a mix of Calvinists, merchants, and various European emigrants, this colony proudly retained a rich cultural link to its festive continental past. In New Amsterdam, Christmas was not banned, it was Sint Nicolaasfeest, and it was the central celebration of the winter season. The Dutch settlers, though largely Protestant or Reformed Church, had no theological objection to honoring St. Nicholas, the 4th century bishop of Myra, renowned as a patron saint of children, sailors, and merchants. The Dutch celebration was unique because it occurred not on December 25th, but on the evening of December 5th, St. Nicholas Eve, followed by the feast day on December 6th. This timing successfully separated the gift-giving ritual from the solemn Christmas Day Mass, allowing the religious and secular aspects of the winter feast to coexist harmoniously. The figure of Sinterklaas, a tall, stately figure dressed as a bishop, often riding a white horse or sailing a ship, was central to the festival. He represented stern yet benevolent authority. On the evening of December 5th, children would leave their shoes or wooden clogs by the fireplace, often filled with hay or a carrot for Sinterklaas's horse. If they had been good, Sinterklaas, sometimes accompanied by his darker helper, Zwarte Piet or Black Pete, would fill their footwear with treats, small toys, and copper coins. If they had been naughty, they might only find a lump of coal or a switch. This tradition provided the mid-Atlantic colonies with the first enduring formalized tradition of a bearded gift-bearing figure who visited homes in the night. It was a ritual built not on pagan excess, but on rewarding virtuous behavior, a concept far more palatable to the broader Protestant community than the rowdy English Christmas. While the main gift-giving occurred in early December, the Dutch continued to celebrate Christmas Day itself with hearty feasting and family visits. Their homes, particularly those of the wealthier merchants, were filled with the warm, spicy aromas of oliebollen, donuts, gingerbread cookies, and copious amounts of spiced wine. The emphasis was on domestic comfort, good food, and kinship, a stark contrast to the austere quietness of Plymouth.
The cultural impact of New Amsterdam was not fully realized until the English took control in 1664 and renamed the colony New York. Even under English rule, the ingrained Dutch customs proved remarkably resilient. The Puritan zealots of New England failed to extend their legislative ban down the coast. While English authorities did attempt to introduce a more Anglo-centric Christmas, the Dutch families quietly maintained their December 5th celebration, ensuring the figure of Sinterklaas never vanished from the American landscape. It was this persistent Dutch memory, the image of the benevolent, chimney-visiting gift-giver, that would be rediscovered and romanticized nearly 2 centuries later by New York authors and poets like Washington Irving and Clement Clarke Moore. The Sinterklaas of New Amsterdam, largely dormant in the English-speaking culture for a generation, was the indispensable missing link that would eventually be anglicized, commercialized, and reborn as the jolly, sleigh-riding Santa Claus. Thus, while the Puritan fathers were actively trying to forget Christmas, the Dutch settlers were actively and happily remembering their own version, preserving the crucial elements of gift-giving and a mythical visitor that would become defining characteristics of the modern American holiday. New Amsterdam served as the vital cultural incubator that kept the festive spirit alive during the long colonial winter. A blend of grandeur and inequality. Moving south from the religiously disciplined North and the commercially grounded Mid-Atlantic, the colonial Christmas underwent yet another transformation. In the vast, wealthy tobacco and rice plantations of colonies like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, the holiday found its most extravagant and contradictory expression. Here, Christmas was not outlawed, nor was it a quiet devotional day. It was a lavish, multi-day spectacle of feasting, hunting, and balls, a grand affirmation of the planter class's wealth and social dominance, built upon the foundation of enslaved labor. Unlike the Puritans, the Anglican gentry of the South held no theological objection to Christmas. In fact, their religious tradition, though sometimes laxly observed, provided the justification for a generous season. The holiday was celebrated as a full 12-day period, echoing the medieval traditions of England that the Pilgrims had so vehemently rejected. This was the time when the Southern aristocrats could publicly display their hospitality, power, and abundance to neighbors and dependents alike. The celebrations were immense. The plantation house was cleaned and decorated with excessive zeal. Wreaths of magnolia, holly, and pine were brought indoors. Great bonfires were lit, immense Yule logs were dragged to the hearth, and barrels of cider and rum punch were prepared. The centerpiece was the feasting. Tables were laden with roast turkey, Virginia ham, venison, and plum pudding. Social visits between plantations were frequent and elaborate, often involving days of riding and staying over. For the planter class, it was the pinnacle of the social calendar. However, the magnificence of the Southern Christmas was inextricably linked to the system of slavery. The preparations, the intensive cleaning, the cooking of vast quantities of food, the polishing of silverware, and the serving of the guests
were all performed by enslaved workers, who often labored harder in the weeks leading up to the holiday than at any other time of the year. Yet Christmas also represented the one annual codified period of respite for the enslaved community. Planters, following tradition and a need to reduce labor resistance, typically granted enslaved people a 3 to 5 day break from their grueling field work, usually stretching from Christmas Day to the New Year. This brief freedom was a double-edged sword, a necessary concession granted by the master, but also a vital window for the enslaved to claim a measure of their own time and culture. During this brief, precious reprieve, enslaved families seized the opportunity to travel across neighboring plantations to visit relatives who had been separated by sale. They held their own distinct celebrations, communal dances, religious services, and quiet rituals that often blended African traditions with the Christian narrative. They feasted on the rations and gifts sometimes reluctantly offered by the master, such as extra molasses, meat, or whiskey. This practice of giving, time, and small gifts served the planters' interest by framing their domination as benevolent. By temporarily relaxing the rules, the master reinforced the idea that he held the power to both grant and withdraw all privileges, often with the implied expectation that the enslaved would work harder upon the holiday's end. The contradiction of the Southern Christmas was profound. The joyous laughter and charitable spirit celebrated in the big house existed simultaneously with the systemic oppression and temporary anxious relief of the enslaved quarters. The very ham on the planter's table had been tended and cooked by hands that were not free. This regional duality, the extravagant revelry and the deeply personal, often mournful observance of the enslaved would define the Southern holiday for centuries. It ensured that, unlike the Puritan Christmas, which was erased and had to be reinvented, the Southern Christmas was a tradition that carried the heavy weight of moral complexity and inequality into the nascent American nation. Political upheaval and holiday suppression. As the American colonies barreled toward revolution in the late 18th century, the already fractured nature of Christmas faced a new and powerful threat: political ideology. For a new nation fighting to define itself against the traditions of monarchy and aristocracy, the holiday, in its existing Southern and English forms, was seen as a cultural liability, too deeply rooted in the very society they were trying to overthrow. The primary conflict was simple. The prevailing form of Christmas, with its elaborate feasting, balls, and enforced charity from the wealthy, was an inherently Anglican and monarchical tradition. It was a visible celebration of the old social order, where the lord of the manor or the wealthy plantation owner demonstrated his authority through lavish hospitality. To embrace such a holiday was, for many ardent patriots, akin to embracing British loyalty. The fervor of republicanism demanded austerity, simplicity, and a relentless focus on public duty, values that stood in direct opposition to the frivolity and extravagance of the traditional 12 days of Christmas. The Puritan legacy, though centuries old, suddenly gained new relevance. The old anti-Christmas arguments about discipline and anti-popery were now recast in a political light as anti-monarchy and anti-aristocracy. During the war years, 1775 to 1783, the holiday faded dramatically across the colonies. In the key northern cities like Boston and Philadelphia, the Puritan tradition had already made celebrating difficult. Now, celebrating Christmas was practically an act of political treason. To decorate a home with the traditional British holly and ivy or to partake in a grand feast risked being labeled a loyalist. Even the Continental Congress, embodying the nation's new Republican spirit, often met and conducted business on Christmas Day, underscoring the shift in priorities. The nation's focus was not on domestic celebration, but on the existential struggle for independence. A pivotal example occurred on Christmas Day, 1776. General Washington, facing crushing defeats and a rapidly disintegrating army, chose that day not for rest or revelry, but for one of the most audacious and desperate military maneuvers in American history, the crossing of the Delaware River to attack the Hessian forces at Trenton. Washington's choice of Christmas night to launch the attack was a calculated psychological blow. It emphasized his army's commitment to duty over tradition and caught the Hessian mercenaries, who were of German background and were likely celebrating the day with traditional German feasting and drinking, completely off guard. This powerful, successful military act sent a clear message. In the American Republic, sacred duty and military necessity superseded the demands of any inherited European holiday. In the southern colonies, where Christmas had been a hallmark of gentry life, the celebrations were forced into retreat. Plantation owners, their wealth disrupted by the war and their loyalty questioned, could no longer maintain the same level of extravagant display. The necessity of war effort, rationing, and the constant fear of invasion silenced much of the grand feasting and balls. Following the war, the creation of the new republic did little to immediately revive the holiday. During the critical decades of nation-building, the lingering memory of the rowdy medieval Christmas mixed with the fresh memory of the political anti-British sentiment kept the celebration marginalized. For many Americans, New Year's Day, a secular date that offered a fresh start and was untainted by the political and religious baggage of Christmas, became the main winter festival for social visits and reflection. In fact, Christmas was often associated with public drunkenness and disorder in American cities of the early 19th century, a continuation of the medieval wassailing tradition, where groups of young men roamed the streets demanding food and drink. This behavior only reinforced the puritanical and republican idea that the holiday was a threat to civic order. The Revolution had thus achieved what the Puritans could only temporarily enforce. It politically discredited the traditional European Christmas. The American holiday tradition now entered a kind of historical deep freeze, waiting for the profound social and literary changes of the 19th century to thaw it out and reinvent it as something entirely new, domestic, and uniquely American. The holiday's post-war reemergence. The conclusion of the Revolutionary War in 1783 left the United States culturally adrift. The nation had successfully cast off the political chains of the monarchy, but in doing so, it had also implicitly rejected many cherished English customs, including the established Christmas celebrations. For nearly 2 decades after the war, Christmas languished in a state of political and social ambiguity. In New England, the ban on celebration had been lifted, but the deeply ingrained Puritan aversion remained. In Boston, schools and businesses routinely operated on December 25th, well into the 19th century. In the South, the planter class struggled to maintain the lavish pre-war feasts due to economic upheaval in a lingering anti-aristocracy sentiment. The holiday was at best a quiet, optional observance. At worst, it was a day associated with public drunkenness and rowdiness, inherited from the old wassailing traditions. The country needed unifying rituals, secular holidays that reflected its new Republican values of industry, equality, and civic virtue. Holidays like the 4th of July or Thanksgiving, often declared locally, fit this mold, but Christmas did not. Yet, as George Washington stepped down from the presidency, establishing the critical tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, the nation entered a period of stability that allowed for a cautious re-engagement with domestic life. It was here, in the quiet post-revolutionary years, that a subtle, non-religious re-emergence of Christmas customs began to take root, largely focusing on the social utility of the season rather than its theological meaning. This revival was driven less by religious leaders and more by the need for familial and social cohesion. In the new, rapidly expanding republic, people were often separated from their extended families. Christmas began to serve a necessary function as a designated time for arduous travel to visit kin. These gatherings were usually simple: a hearty meal, some shared ale, and a focus on domestic tranquility, distinctly lacking the formal structure of the English manor house celebration. George Washington himself, a figure whose customs carried immense weight in the new nation, served as an imperfect model. While he was a practical man who understood the strategic importance of his army working on Christmas, he was also a Virginia planter. At his home, Mount Vernon, the Christmas period was marked by hospitality. Guests were often present, and the period between Christmas and New Year's Day was reserved for social calls, dancing, and the exchange of small tokens of respect. Washington's celebration was an echo of the old Southern style, refined, polite, and contained, and it offered one acceptable model for the fledgling American elite, a holiday stripped of its Catholic Puritan conflict and recast as a marker of genteel, Americanized hospitality.
The key to this early reemergence was its pluralism and ambiguity. Since there was no national standard, various ethnic and regional groups maintained their distinct customs. The Dutch continued their Sinterklaas rituals in New York. The German communities quietly celebrated with their concealed trees and candles in Pennsylvania. The Anglicans in Virginia held simple services. This period was one of experimentation. Americans were trying to decide, what was an American Christmas supposed to look like? The answer, during the final decades of the 18th century, was that it looked like whatever your local community permitted. The holiday existed in a fragmented, low-key state, held back by the lingering Puritan suspicion and the patriotic aversion to anything too British. The stage was set for a fundamental change. The holiday was no longer banned, but it was viewed with suspicion and lacked a unified identity. It needed a new narrative, one that could erase the memory of public disorder and political conflict and replace it with a unifying vision of domesticity and peace. That new narrative would not come from the church or the state, but from the imaginative pens of America's first great literary figures. Irving's vision of a genteel holiday. By the early 19th century, the American Christmas was at a critical impasse. In major urban centers like New York and Philadelphia, the holiday was predominantly an occasion for lower-class disorder. Gangs of young men, the descendants of the old English wassailers, roamed the streets demanding drinks and disrupting public order, reinforcing the old Puritan fears. The commercial classes and the burgeoning middle class desired a holiday that was orderly, moral, and focused on the home, but they lacked the cohesive cultural model. The necessary transformation was not driven by religious doctrine or political decree, but by the power of nostalgia and literature. The catalyst for this cultural revolution was the witty, observant pen of New Yorker Washington Irving. In 1809, Irving published A History of New York, from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty, under the satirical pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. Though largely a humorous, fictitious work, it contains several highly influential passages about the Dutch Christmas traditions of New Amsterdam. Irving, recognizing the need for an American-friendly winter myth, resurrected the Dutch Sinterklaas figure, blending him with English traditions and giving him a whimsical, distinctly American character. However, Irving's most profound and lasting contribution came in 1820 with the publication of The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent. Within this collection of essays were 5 short pieces collectively titled Old Christmas, which described an idealized English Christmas observed by Crayon while visiting a grand, hospitable manor house. It is crucial to understand that Irving was not reporting on contemporary English Christmas. He was in fact inventing a myth. The boisterous, often aggressive medieval traditions had largely faded in England as well. Irving's vision was a conscious act of historical nostalgia, reaching back to an imagined pre-Puritan golden age of Christmas. Emphasis on the gentry. The celebration was led by a benevolent, patriarchal squire who opened his home and heart to tenants and neighbors alike, embodying kindness and stability. Domestic tranquility. The focus was heavily placed on the fireplace, the family dinner table, and indoor games, a celebration of domesticity rather than street revelry. Social harmony. The holiday was portrayed as a great social leveler, where rich and poor briefly mingled in mutual respect and charity, offering a unifying vision for a rapidly class-conscious America. Irving's vision presented a stark alternative to the American urban reality of the time. He offered the American middle class a model for a holiday that was respectable, sentimental, and morally uplifting. It was a Christmas that could be enjoyed in the parlor, away from the dangers of the street. The impact was immediate and enormous. Irving's Old Christmas stories became instant classics, defining the idea of Christmas for generations of Americans, and helping to shift the holiday's focus from public disorder to private familial peace. Irving successfully sanitized the old European traditions, stripping them of their aggressive edges and cloaking them in a gentle, warm sentimentality that was perfectly suited to the emerging Victorian era. More importantly, Irving's work helped to re-legitimize the holiday in the puritanical North. By presenting Christmas as an ancient, quaint, and harmonizing custom rather than a popish excess, he provided intellectual cover for Americans who wished to celebrate. In essence, Irving gifted the fragmented American nation a usable past and a blueprint for the future. He provided the literary spark that would soon ignite the imaginations of other New York authors, leading directly to the creation of the modern, standardized American Christmas figure, the benevolent Saint Nick, who would permanently embody the new values of hearth, home, and generosity. 'Twas the night before Christmas and Saint Nick's makeover. Washington Irving had successfully established a narrative for a respectable domestic Christmas, but the holiday still lacked the unifying, universal icon. The figure of the gift giver was fragmented. The Dutch had their stately, bishop-like Sinterklaas, the Germans their Christkindl, and the English traditions often featured Father Christmas, a personification of feasting, not a bringer of gifts to children. This chaos of custom demanded a single, recognizable figure that could transcend regional and ethnic differences. The man who provided this standardized vision was Clement Clark Moore, a wealthy, reserved professor of Oriental and Greek literature and divinity at the General Theological Seminary in New York City. On Christmas Eve, 1822, Moore wrote the poem titled A Visit from St. Nicholas for his own children. He had no intention of publishing it. It was a private, domestic gift. However, a family friend, Miss Harriet Butler, secretly copied the poem and submitted it to the Troy Sentinel, a newspaper upstate, where it was published anonymously on December 23, 1823. The poem's immediate and explosive popularity was due to its revolutionary and comprehensive description of the gift giver, which finally synthesized the disparate elements of the ancient holiday into a single, cohesive, Americanized myth. Moore's poem was an absolute masterclass in cultural invention. He took the Dutch Sinterklaas, stripped him entirely of his bishop's vestments and religious authority, and recast him as a non-threatening, whimsical, elf-like creature perfectly suited to the sentimental, middle-class, child-centered home. The poem provided the world with the fundamental, non-negotiable characteristics of the modern Santa Claus. 1. Physical appearance. Saint Nick was described as chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, with a round little belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl of jelly. This shifted the icon from a stern religious figure to a warm, grandfatherly presence. 2. Mode of transport. Moore replaced the bishop's horse, the ship, or the walking pilgrimage with the now iconic miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. He even gave the reindeer names, adding a layer of whimsical, memorable detail to the myth. 3. The entry point. The poem explicitly stated that Saint Nick came down the chimney, cementing the enduring image that links the gift giver to the domestic hearth, a direct descendant of the Dutch tradition of leaving shoes by the fireplace. 4. The delivery time. The visit occurred the night before Christmas, establishing the standard timing for gift delivery, reinforcing the domestic, silent nature of the ritual. Moore's work successfully completed the transformation begun by Washington Irving. Irving had invented the setting, the genteel domestic Christmas. Moore invented the protagonist. Crucially, by making Saint Nick small and magical, Moore made him non-threatening and non-denominational, allowing Protestants and Catholics, New Englanders and Southerners to adopt him universally. The poem was reprinted endlessly, becoming the single most important text defining the American Christmas experience. It standardized the mythology, and this standardization paved the way for the next phase, commercialization. Once everyone knew what Santa looked like and what he did, artists and marketers could reproduce his image relentlessly.
Within a few decades, Moore's Saint Nick was further solidified by influential American illustrators like Thomas Nast, who in the 1860s provided the visual template for the modern Santa, a large bearded man in a red suit. But it was Moore's simple rhyming poem, written for his own children in a quiet New York study, that provided the foundational myth, turning a fragmented colonial custom into a universal American icon of generosity and domestic magic. The New York poem, initially an anonymous trifle, had fundamentally rewired the cultural DNA of the holiday, ensuring that the American Christmas would forever be dominated by the sleigh bells, the reindeer, and the jolly figure of Saint Nick. The Gospel of Generosity and Redemption. The literary transformation of Christmas, begun by Washington Irving and solidified by Clement Clarke Moore, still lacked a crucial element, a profound moral imperative. The holiday had been successfully pulled from the chaotic streets into the domestic parlor, but it risked becoming merely a sentimental, materialistic exchange of gifts. It needed a story, a secular gospel that would provide the emotional and ethical foundation for its revival. That story arrived in 1843, not from an American pen, but from the most famous novelist of the English-speaking world, Charles Dickens. His novella, A Christmas Carol, in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas, was an immediate, electrifying global phenomenon that completed the redefinition of the holiday for the Victorian age, an influence that was particularly potent in America. Dickens wrote the carol at a time when he was deeply concerned about poverty, industrial exploitation, and the cold indifference of the wealthy classes. His protagonist, Ebenezer Scrooge, was the perfect symbol of this social malady, a man who saw Christmas only as a disruption to his business, grumbling, "Bah, humbug." The novella's power lay not in theological argument, but in its emotional narrative of social reform and personal redemption. Dickens accomplished several critical things that permanently imprinted the holiday's meaning onto the Western consciousness, especially in America. 1. The moralization of merriment. Dickens successfully reconciled the religious seriousness of the Puritans with the need for joy and celebration. He argued that Christmas merriment was not a sign of sin, but a moral obligation. To celebrate was to recognize the shared humanity of all people, rich and poor. The warmth of the Cratchits' meager feast became a powerful symbol of spiritual wealth, far surpassing Scrooge's material fortune. 2. The focus on generosity and charity. The core message of the carol was the imperative of generosity. Scrooge's transformation proved that money was not to be hoarded, but actively used to relieve want and suffering.
This narrative arrived in America at a critical time, offering the rapidly growing middle and commercial classes a respectable, non-religious avenue for public virtue. Charitable giving suddenly became an essential, defining component of the American Christmas spirit. 3. The sentimentality of family. The suffering of Tiny Tim, God bless us every one, elevated the importance of the child to the center of the holiday. Dickens's vision cemented the idea of Christmas as a time for family togetherness, empathy, and the quiet appreciation of domestic blessings. This further reinforced the shift away from the old boisterous public celebrations toward the Irving-esque ideal of a quiet, home-centered holiday. 4. The celebration of the secular. While the story features ghosts, it avoids all ecclesiastical doctrine. The carol effectively provided a secular gospel of goodness and community renewal. This made it universally palatable in a religiously diverse America, where Puritans, Catholics, and various Protestant groups could all agree on the moral value of charity, repentance, and kindness. The Christmas Carol was an overwhelming success in America. It was read aloud in countless homes, serialized in newspapers, and adapted for the stage almost immediately. The phrase Merry Christmas itself gained a new moral weight, becoming synonymous with the kind of boundless goodwill exemplified by the reformed Scrooge. Dickens essentially gave the new American Christmas, which had the physical setting, Irving, and the icon, Moore, its soul. He provided the narrative framework that transcended both the Puritan ban and the rowdy Saturnalian spirit, defining Christmas as a sacred contract of human kindness, a yearly opportunity for collective and personal redemption. It cemented the idea that an American Christmas, above all, was a time to open one's heart and purse to those less fortunate. Prince Albert, immigrants, and the rise of the evergreen. With the moral compass set by Dickens and the whimsical icon established by Moore, the American Christmas was still missing its central physical stage, the visual centerpiece that would gather the family and the gifts. That stage was the Christmas tree, an ancient symbol of life and light that was imported to the United States not once, but twice, first quietly by immigrants and later dramatically via transatlantic celebrity. The earliest, most persistent presence of the decorated evergreen in North America came from the German immigrant communities that had settled across Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic colonies since the 17th century. As detailed previously, these groups, particularly the Moravians and Lutherans, cherished the Weihnachtsbaum, Christmas tree. For them, the tree symbolized the regenerative nature of Christ's life and the tree of paradise. These colonial trees were humble and domestic, often small sprigs or branches brought into the home and placed on a tabletop. They were typically decorated with candles, representing Christ as the light of the world, paper flowers, nuts, apples, and small baked goods. Crucially, these trees were almost always kept private and internal, hidden from the suspicious eyes of their non-German neighbors who still associated the practice with heathen forest worship and European customs. For decades, the Christmas tree remained a beautiful, secret rite practiced within ethnic enclaves. The turning point that propelled the Christmas tree from a localized ethnic curiosity to a national phenomenon occurred not in America, but in Britain, and was driven by German-born royalty. In 1846, the Illustrated London News published a captivating drawing of Britain's Queen Victoria and her German consort Prince Albert gathered with their children around a decorated Christmas tree at Windsor Castle. The tree was elegantly adorned with candles and ornaments. This image was instantly iconic. Queen Victoria was hugely popular, and the drawing presented a perfect vision of the genteel, domestic, and morally upright Christmas that the burgeoning Victorian middle class, both in Britain and America, craved. Within a few short years, the image was reprinted in American magazines, including Godey's Lady's Book, 1850, the most influential women's publication of the era. The impact of this royal endorsement was transformative.
Americans had always been wary of adopting British customs, but the tree was German, not English, giving it a palatable European pedigree. More importantly, the royal family's endorsement perfectly aligned the tree with the new sacred values of the holiday: family, innocence, and domesticity. The tree was a safe indoor ritual. It offered a beautiful way to display gifts and gather the family around the hearth, serving as a clean break from the old public drunkenness of the pre-Puritan era. The combination of German immigrant presence and Victorian endorsement ensured the tree's swift popularization. By the 1850s, the Christmas tree was being sold commercially in New York, and within a generation, it was virtually essential to the American holiday celebration. The tree provided the final structural element, a powerful, unifying visual symbol that could hold the gifts of Santa Claus and serve as the focus for the sentimentality preached by Dickens and Irving. It tied together the ancient pagan symbolism of the evergreen with the Christian narrative of light, completing the physical and emotional architecture of the modern American Christmas. The once secret candle in the cold had become the dazzling, ubiquitous centerpiece of the American December. Christmas becomes a federal holiday. Lincoln's wartime declaration. By the mid-19th century, the American Christmas had achieved a fragile cultural acceptance, thanks to the literary efforts of Irving and Moore, the moral guidance of Dickens, and the visual centerpiece of the German tree. Yet, despite its sentimental popularity, the holiday still lacked national legitimacy. In the South, Christmas was a tradition. In the North, it remained a discretionary, often suspicious observance. It was still not universally recognized, and federal offices routinely remained open on December 25th. The act that finally transformed Christmas from a cultural custom to a binding national institution was born not out of peace, but out of the profound national trauma of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was a cultural crucible that forced Americans to re-examine what truly defined their nation. Amidst the carnage, President Abraham Lincoln and the Republican-led Union government instinctively understood the need for unifying symbols and domestic comfort. The puritanical fervor against Christmas had largely waned in the North, replaced by a deep yearning for home, family, and peace, the very sentiments now associated with the Dickensian holiday. Throughout the war, Lincoln himself embraced the newly domesticated Christmas. His family celebrated in the White House with a decorated tree, and he allowed small festivities for the soldiers. More significantly, the war created a shared national emotional experience. The celebration of Christmas by soldiers in the field, away from home, became a powerful image of shared sacrifice and longing. The most critical political move, however, came shortly after the war's conclusion, during the period of Reconstruction. In 1870, under President Ulysses S. Grant, Lincoln's successor after his assassination, Congress passed an act that formally designated Christmas Day as one of the nation's first 4 federal holidays, along with New Year's Day, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving. Although Lincoln was no longer alive, this decision was the culmination of the wartime understanding that the country needed unifying, non-sectarian festivals that transcended regional and ideological divides. The declaration was a powerful act of political reconciliation. 1. Unifying the calendar. By making Christmas a federal holiday, the government effectively ended the centuries-long Puritan resistance in New England. It mandated that post offices and government offices close, forcing the remnants of the anti-Christmas movement to conform to the national standard. 2. Bridging the divide. The federal recognition embraced the Southern tradition of celebrating the day, while filtering it through the Northern lens of domesticity and order. The new federal Christmas was a universal holiday that could be celebrated equally in Boston and Richmond, without the political baggage of either Puritanism or aristocracy. 3. Establishing a national narrative. The move sanctified the new sentimental Christmas, the one featuring Santa Claus, the family tree, and charitable giving. It affirmed that this was the kind of virtuous, family-centered nation they were trying to rebuild.
It is often mistakenly believed that Lincoln declared Christmas a federal holiday during the war, but the true significance lies in the timing. The 1870 Declaration was an essential component of the Reconstruction effort. The government utilized this newly unified sentimental holiday to help bind together a fractured nation. By officially recognizing Christmas, the United States affirmed its commitment to domestic peace and familial goodwill, a deliberate contrast to the recent years of bloody fraternal conflict. Thus, the American Christmas completed its journey from a banned medieval riot to a sanctioned domestic ideal. The holiday's official status cemented its place not just in American hearts, but in American law, setting the stage for its final transformation, the era of mass marketing and commercialization. The Gilded Age window displays. With the Civil War resolved and the holiday officially sanctioned, the American Christmas was ripe for its final, most comprehensive transformation, its commercialization. The late 19th century, the Gilded Age, was characterized by unprecedented industrial growth, mass production, and the rise of a vast, aspirational middle class. This new economic reality required a new kind of holiday, one that celebrated consumption and affluence. The agents of this transformation were the massive, glittering department stores of America's burgeoning cities. The department store was a uniquely Gilded Age institution. Unlike the small, specialized shops of the past, these retail palaces offered a dizzying array of goods under one roof. They were designed not merely for shopping, but for experience and entertainment, particularly for middle and upper-class women. Christmas provided the perfect opportunity to utilize this space for maximum effect. The key to unlocking the holiday's retail potential lay in the window display. Before this era, store windows were plain and practical. Retailers like R.H. Macy & Co. in New York and Marshall Field's in Chicago recognized that the sentimentality championed by Dickens and the whimsical fantasy created by Moore could be translated into a powerful visual language designed to induce buying. In the 1870s and 1880s, the Christmas window display evolved from a simple arrangement of goods into elaborate, highly detailed animated theatrical spectacles. They were scenes of pure fantasy, miniature villages, animated figures of St. Nick descending chimneys, and displays of elaborate dolls and toys that captivated children and enchanted their parents. Macy's, in particular, became synonymous with the Christmas spectacle. They were among the first to bring the Christmas tree out of the private German parlor and into the public eye, often featuring immense, dazzling trees adorned with imported glass ornaments. They popularized the idea of the store itself as a temporary holiday shrine, a place where the magic of Christmas was visibly manifested. The commercialization of the holiday offered a solution to the ongoing Puritan dilemma. It successfully converted the old, disorderly public Christmas into an orderly, consumer-driven public spectacle. Instead of demanding drinks from the wealthy, the public was invited to admire the wealth displayed in the windows and purchase small tokens of that affluence. Crucially, the department stores institutionalized the figure of Santa Claus as their primary brand ambassador. They established the tradition of the in-store Santa, a live costumed figure to greet children, transforming the distant magical character of the poem into a tangible commercial reality. They created the need for standardized toys and mass-produced goods. The sentimental focus on gift-giving, previously limited to a few handmade items, now required a massive inventory of affordable, reproducible gifts to fill the space beneath the tree. The new commercial Christmas effectively completed the holiday's shift in focus. It was no longer about religious observance, the Puritan complaint, or aristocratic feasting, the Southern tradition, but about child-centered, sentimental giving. By framing consumption as an act of familial love and virtue, a visible expression of Dickensian generosity, the stores overcame much of the lingering moral resistance to celebrating. If you bought gifts for your children, You were being a good, virtuous American family. By the turn of the 20th century, the department store window was the defining signal that Christmas had arrived. It was the moment the American holiday officially transitioned from a quiet domestic ritual to a full-blown public retail event, linking the ideals of family and generosity with the economic imperative of consumption. The spectacle had begun, and it would only grow larger.
The final standardization of Santa Claus. By the turn of the 20th century, the American Santa Claus was a familiar figure, thanks to Clement Clark Moore's poem and the early engravings of artists like Thomas Nast. However, Santa's appearance still lacked a consistent, globally recognized form. Artists depicted him in various hues, sometimes brown, sometimes green, and often in a slimmer, more elfin form, as Moore had originally envisioned. The final, definitive transformation of Santa Claus, the image that became cemented as the universal symbol of Christmas across continents, was not the work of a poet, a novelist, or an illustrator, but of a soft drink company, the Coca-Cola Company. In the early 1930s, Coca-Cola faced a significant marketing challenge. Their sugary drink was overwhelmingly associated with warm weather and summertime refreshment. They needed a way to encourage consumers to buy Coke during the winter months. The solution was to link their product to the winter season's biggest cultural event, Christmas, and to use the holiday's most popular figure as their spokesperson. In 1931, Coca-Cola commissioned the Swedish-American artist Haddon Sundblom to create a series of Christmas advertisements. Sundblom's task was to create a Santa that was not only appealing, but also robust, realistic, and universally recognizable. He drew heavily upon Moore's poem, Chubby and Plump, a Right Jolly Old Elf, but rejected the elf part, instead creating a larger-than-life, warm, and distinctly human grandfather figure. Sundblom's Santa provided the enduring visual features that are now considered gospel. 1. The iconic red and white. While Santa had appeared in red before, Sundblom standardized the bright red coat trimmed with thick white fur. This color choice, while not mandated by the Coca-Cola brand, which was already well established, strongly reinforced the company's trademark colors in the public eye. 2. The jolly demeanor. Sundblom's Santa was perpetually beaming. He had rosy cheeks, twinkling eyes, a perpetually benevolent expression, and a powerful, contagious sense of joy. The model for this warmth was initially a retired salesman named Lou Prentice, who perfectly embodied the gentle, grandfatherly image. 3. The human scale. Unlike the small, elf-like figures that had persisted, Sundblom's Santa was tall, robust, and completely believable as the generous, larger-than-life hero of the children. He was not a sprite, he was a benevolent giant of human kindness. For the next 35 years, Sundblom painted a new Coke Santa advertisement almost every year, and the images were reproduced in magazines, billboards, and point-of-sale displays across the globe. This was mass marketing on an unprecedented scale. Because of Coca-Cola's vast reach, Sundblom's interpretation became the most frequently viewed, widely distributed, and consistently presented image of Santa Claus in the world. The impact was immediate and irreversible. The company didn't technically invent Santa, but they successfully used commercial advertising to standardize and universalize his image. They stripped away the last vestiges of regional variation, ensuring that whether you were in London, Tokyo, or rural Alabama, the gift bringer looked exactly the same. This final commercial step perfectly solidified the American cultural creation. The Santa Claus that emerged from the Coca-Cola campaign was a non-denominational, non-political figure whose purpose was singular, to embody the joy of giving, making him the perfect mascot for the consumer society. The historical journey, from a banned religious feast to a chaotic street party and finally to a sentimental domestic ritual, was complete. Santa Claus, the symbol of American generosity and commercial might, was ready to conquer the world. Christmas under rationing and the spirit of sacrifice. The great world wars of the 20th century
World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, 1941 to 1945, forced the American Christmas to confront hardship on an unprecedented scale. Having shed its Puritan inhibitions and embraced commercial prosperity, the holiday now faced the ultimate test, maintaining its sentimental magic while the nation grappled with resource scarcity, military sacrifice, and profound anxiety. In this crucible of conflict, the American Christmas was imbued with a new, powerful sense of patriotism and resilience. The initial shift. During World War I, the holiday quickly adapted to support the war effort. The focus shifted from material extravagance to practical support. Instead of purchasing elaborate gifts, Americans were urged to buy Liberty bonds and contribute to war charities. Christmas cards often featured patriotic imagery. The core element of sacrifice was introduced, as families sent Christmas boxes filled with small comforts, cigarettes, and simple gifts to soldiers fighting overseas. A poignant lasting change from this era was the transformation of the Christmas tree's meaning. It became a symbol of remembrance and hope. Communities erected large community Christmas trees, often sponsored by the Red Cross, dedicated to the troops abroad, emphasizing shared sacrifice over private consumption.
The crucible of tradition. The impact of World War II was far more extensive and defining. The conflict imposed severe rationing on nearly every facet of American life, from gasoline and sugar to metal and paper. This forced a dramatic yet temporary reversal of the commercialism that had dominated the Gilded Age. The rationed Christmas. Gifts shortages dictated that gifts be practical or homemade. Toys made of metal were replaced by those of wood or fabric. Families used wrapping paper sparingly. This return to simple, handmade gifts ironically reinforced the very sentimental values of domesticity and thrift championed by Dickens. Food. The immense Christmas feast, a staple since the Southern colonial days, faced challenges. Sugar was heavily rationed, limiting the use of traditional desserts like fruitcake and cookies. Families proudly displayed their ingenuity, creating meals using ration stamps and local produce, turning the preparation itself into a patriotic act of resilience. Decorations. The war effort required the conservation of electricity, leading to subdued lighting displays. Metal ornaments and tinsel, which used vital tin, became scarce, prompting a return to natural decorations like popcorn strings, cranberries, and homemade paper chains. The true heart of the wartime Christmas, however, lay in its support for the troops. Christmas was inextricably linked with the painful reality of separation. Families across the nation experienced the agonizing gap at the dinner table left by a son, husband, or father fighting in the Pacific or Europe. This separation fueled a massive national effort to ensure servicemen and women felt remembered. Millions of letters, V-mail or victory mail, and packages were sent overseas, often addressed to any serviceman. This collective outpouring of generosity transformed the holiday into a national act of compassion and unity. Christmas on the front line for soldiers was a powerful symbol of the home they were fighting for. Commanders often went to great lengths to provide a special meal or service, usually featuring a chaplain-led service and a small shared moment of respite. These moments of peace, often captured in photographs of troops sharing a meager feast or gathered around a small, improvised tree in a bunker, reinforced the moral righteousness of their fight. The wartime Christmas movies and songs cemented this poignant image of longing and hope. Songs like "I'll Be Home for Christmas" 1943 became national anthems, blending the sentimental desire for domestic comfort with the reality of military separation. The song wasn't just about coming home, it was about the collective hope for peace that would allow all American families to be reunited. When the wars ended, the celebration returned to its commercial roots with overwhelming force, but the memory of the war years left an indelible mark. It proved that the American Christmas transcended mere material wealth. It was a profound symbol of familial love, national unity, and the enduring hope for peace, sentiments that were hard-won and deeply cherished. Now, continuing your historical narrative, focusing on the subtitle, The Pop Culture Phenomenon, Silver Bells, White Christmas, and Hollywood, I will write a detailed, substantial section, approximately 700 to 1,000 words, that explores how 20th century American media, especially film and music, solidified and exported a single, highly sentimental, and idealized vision of Christmas globally. This section covers the final step in establishing the American version of the holiday as the universal standard. Silver Bells, White Christmas, and Hollywood. By the mid-20th century, the American Christmas was officially sanctioned, commercially driven, and centered on the family. The final element needed to cement its global dominance was media. Through Hollywood films, network television, and the burgeoning music industry, the United States didn't just celebrate a holiday, it manufactured and exported an idealized, nostalgic vision of Christmas that transcended religious, ethnic, and even national borders. The agent of this cultural supremacy was the American Christmas song. These songs were essential because they were non-political, universally emotional, and easily reproducible. They bypassed the intellectual and historical baggage that had plagued the holiday for centuries, appealing directly to sentiment. The catalyst for this musical transformation was the longing created by World War II. In 1942, Irving Berlin wrote the song White Christmas. Performed by Bing Crosby, the song captured the quiet, wistful ache of separation felt by soldiers overseas and families at home. It became the best-selling single of all time for decades. Its success established the formula for the modern Christmas hit, a blend of melancholy nostalgia, a longing for home and peace, and a universal romanticized winter setting. The image of the White Christmas quickly became the aspirational standard for the holiday, regardless of whether listeners lived in snowy Maine or sun-drenched Australia. Following this blueprint, the floodgates opened. Songs like The Christmas Song, Merry Christmas to You, 1944, by Torme and Wells, featuring chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Let It Snow, Let It Snow, Let It Snow, 1945, and Silver Bells, 1950, all contributed to a coherent, emotionally resonant mythology. This music solidified several key components of the ideal American Christmas.
The weather. Christmas must be snowy, picturesque, and cold. The setting. The focus must be on the cozy, warm indoors, the contrast between the snowy outside and the brightly lit hearth. The tone. A blend of sweetness, optimism, and gentle nostalgia for childhood. The Hollywood ideal. Simultaneously, Hollywood films provided the visual liturgy for this new secular religion. Movies of the 1940s and 1950s took the moral lessons of A Christmas Carol and the visual framework of the department stores and turned them into cinematic templates. Miracle on 34th Street, 1947. This film was a cultural watershed. Set primarily in Macy's department store, it dealt directly with the conflict between skepticism and belief, effectively validating the commercial Santa Claus as a necessary force for good and community spirit. It taught audiences that to believe in Santa was to believe in goodwill and generosity, tying the retail experience directly to moral virtue. It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. While initially a box office failure, this film, directed by Frank Capra, became the quintessential Christmas classic through repeated television airings decades later. Its story of George Bailey's redemption and the value of community perfectly encapsulated the Dickensian themes of empathy and the irreplaceable value of a simple, virtuous life.
It taught that the true wealth of Christmas was the love of friends and family. White Christmas, 1954. The film featuring the iconic song further solidified the ideal of Christmas as a time for military comradeship, domestic partnership, and the restoration of traditional values. Through these films and songs, the American version of Christmas, clean, white, sentimental, focused on domestic harmony and celebrated with a standardized Santa and a brightly lit tree, became the dominant global paradigm. Countries with completely different historical traditions, from Japan to Brazil, began to adopt these American pop culture aesthetics, proving the power of a sentimental myth crafted by commerce and media. The Puritan ban and the Southern feast were now distant history. The world was celebrating Christmas the way Hollywood sang about it. Christmas in the globalized age, synthesis and secularization. The American Christmas of the 21st century stands as a profound testament to the nation's unique cultural history, a complex, sometimes contradictory blend of ancient pagan feasting, puritanical guilt, Victorian sentimentality, and unparalleled commercial might. The holiday that was once banned in New England is now the single largest retail event in the Western world and America's most recognizable cultural export. The contemporary American Christmas is defined by a state of perfect synthesis, where traditions that were once mortal enemies now coexist peacefully and often simultaneously. The sacred and the secular merge. The religious observance, the Nativity Decree, remains the spiritual heart for Christians, marked by quiet church services and Advent reflection. Yet this sacred core is entirely enveloped by the secular apparatus, the Santa Claus icon, the Christmas tree spectacle, and the ritual of gift-giving, all of which appeal to a broad non-denominational audience seeking themes of kindness, family, and hope. The commercialization of virtue. The moral imperative preached by Dickens, charity and generosity, has been successfully integrated into the logic of the department store spectacle. Consumption is now framed as the purest expression of love. Americans spend billions of dollars viewing the purchase of gifts as fulfilling a moral, familial, and economic duty, creating the phenomenon of shop-till-you-drop philanthropy. Global export. Thanks to the standardization provided by Hollywood and mass media, the pop culture phenomenon, the American Christmas is the global standard. From Japan's KFC Christmas feasts to European cities adopting American-style light displays, the image created by Irving, Moore, and Coca-Cola is the template for global winter celebration, irrespective of local religious demographics or climate. The challenge of secularization. The primary defining characteristic of the contemporary holiday is its increasing secularization. As American society has grown more diverse and less overtly religious, the focus has shifted away from Christ's birth toward the universal themes of the holiday season. Inclusivity over exclusivity. Public spaces, retail giants, and government institutions increasingly use neutral language, happy holidays, to be inclusive of Jewish traditions, Hanukkah, African American celebrations, Kwanzaa, and non-believers. This is a direct reversal of the rigid, exclusive theology of the Puritan purge, reflecting a pluralistic society where religious identity is no longer monolithic. The dominance of nostalgia. The holiday now functions primarily as an engine of nostalgia, the collective memory, fueled by media repetition of songs and films from the 1940s and 1950s, the war years era, has created an idealized mythic past, a perfect Christmas that rarely existed, but serves as an annual emotional benchmark for modern families. The enduring legacy. In its final form, the American Christmas is a triumphant, though often contradictory, synthesis. It is a day that successfully bridges the historical gulf. It honors the German tradition by centering on the decorated tree. It pays homage to the Dutch tradition through its icon, Santa Claus. It quietly respects the Puritan stance by being highly structured, focusing on the immediate family unit and often excluding the anarchic public revelry of its medieval ancestors. The journey from the Plymouth Day of Labor to the globalized spectacle of light and commerce reveals a powerful truth. The American identity is defined by its ability to assimilate, sanitize, and repurpose tradition. The celebration is no longer a theological mandate. It is a cultural necessity. It is the one moment each year where Americans pause their relentless work, reaffirm their commitment to family, and symbolically participate in a national act of optimism and goodwill, hoping, as Timmy Tim wished, that God bless us everyone.